Part 1. The ground shook before I could take my next breath. I had been crouched behind a collapsed wall for 19 hours. My 4 hands were steady. They are always steady, that is the Sohari way, but my mind was anything but calm. The scanner on my wrist blinked red every few seconds, feeding me data I did not want to read. 2 Vulcan soldiers down, 1 Dravathi officer with a fractured leg unable to stand. Enemy heat signatures closing from 3 directions at once. And in the middle of all of it, 1 human. I had heard about humans before I ever met one. Every field medic in the coalition has. You pass through enough medical tents, enough recovery wards, enough late night debriefing rooms, and their name comes up the same way a rumor does, quietly, carefully, like the person saying it is not entirely sure they believe it themselves. I had a senior surgeon, a Dravathi named Orev, pull me aside during my second deployment and say to me, almost in a whisper, if you ever serve alongside a human, do not try to understand them with your head. You will fail. Just watch them. Instead, I had smiled politely and thought nothing more of it. That was before Karath IV. Staff Sergeant Marcus Vale, that was his name, 34 years old according to his coalition file. Born on a colony world called New Ohio, which I later learned was a place settled by people who had wanted land and quiet and had received very little of either. His file listed his height as average for a human male, his weight standard, his service record long. There were commendations in that file, more than I expected, more than most, but none of them told me what I actually needed to know. None of them told me what he was like to stand next to when the world was coming apart at the seams. He was not the largest soldier in our unit. The Vulcan soldiers were taller, broader, built like the stone walls of their home cities. The Dravathi were faster, with reflexes that made most other species look as though they were moving through deep water. I myself had 4 arms and twice the manual dexterity of any human alive. On paper, Marcus Vale was unremarkable. He had a habit I noticed in the early hours of the engagement. He would move along our defensive line quietly, not drawing attention, checking on each soldier without being asked. He adjusted firing positions. He redistributed ammunition from the supply packs before anyone thought to request it. He spoke in short, calm sentences, and every so often, when he thought no one was watching, he would press 2 fingers against his collarbone briefly, just for a second before lowering his hand and going back to work. A personal ritual, I supposed. I noted it in my log without understanding it. He carried more ammunition than standard regulation allowed. I remember thinking, when I first noticed this, that it was either confidence or recklessness. I understood later that it was neither. It was arithmetic. He had looked at our situation, measured how long the engagement was likely to last, and packed accordingly. That was simply how he thought. The Vreth Dominion does not fight wars. That is the wrong word for what they do. They conduct removals. They arrive on a world, identify everything living on it, and they remove it. They are large. The average Vreth soldier stands a full head above a Dravathi, and they are bred for war from birth. Their armor is organic, grown from a material that hardens on impact. Their weapons are designed to destroy morale as thoroughly as they destroy bodies. When a Vreth unit charges, they produce a sound that I will not attempt to describe here, except to say that my species has 4 ears, and all 4 of them find that sound genuinely painful. Our unit had been holding the eastern wall of a coalition resupply station on Karath IV for nearly a full planetary day. The station was not important in the traditional strategic sense. There was no rare mineral beneath it. There was no classified weapon stored inside it. What it had was a civilian evacuation corridor running through its lower levels. 47,000 civilians were moving through tunnels beneath our feet at that very moment, working their way toward the orbital lifts on the far side of the continent. We were the reason those tunnels stayed open. We were the delay between those people and the Vreth, and every hour we held was another hour. The lifts kept running. Marcus knew this. He had read the same briefing the rest of us had. The difference was that he had read it and then done something the rest of us had spent 19 hours quietly struggling with. He had accepted it fully, cleanly, without any visible need to discuss or revisit it. The Vreth came through the wall at the 17th hour. Not around it, not over it, through it. They brought a siege driver, a machine the size of a small building mounted on heavy tracks, and they rolled it forward and used it to simply push through the fortified eastern wall as though it were made of. For 17 hours ceased to exist in approximately 4 seconds. The noise was extraordinary. Dust and rubble filled the air. 2 of our Vulcan soldiers were buried under the collapse. I ran toward them automatically, my medical kit already open in 2 of my hands. That was when I saw the Vreth heavy. They are called heavies in coalition military language. The formal Vreth term translates roughly as finishers. They are not standard soldiers. They are specialized, bred, taller, trained, longer, equipped with a weapon called a Wormhole, a powered impact device that generates a force greater than most vehicle collisions. A single strike from a Wormhole against an unarmored target produces injuries no field medic can treat in the field. Against armored targets, it produces the same injuries, only slightly more slowly. This particular heavy was the largest living thing I had ever encountered. Outside of a conservation enclosure, it stood over 3 m. Its armor was dark and ridged, and it moved with the unhurried heaviness of something that had never, in its entire life, had any reason to be afraid. It came through the rubble of the collapsed wall and immediately fixed its targeting sensors. The Vreth have sensors built into their helmet visors on our defensive line. Marcus stepped forward. I want to be precise about this because it matters. The rest of our unit stepped back, not in panic, not in disorder, but in the instinctive way that living things respond to approaching danger. Every soldier in that line moved back 1/2 step, every soldier except Marcus, who moved forward 1 full step. He raised his weapon, the heavy charged. What happened next lasted perhaps 8 seconds. It felt considerably longer. Marcus fired twice. The round struck the heavy's chest plate and did what rounds typically do against Vreth heavy armor. They left surface marks and accomplished nothing further. The heavy did not slow down. It raised the Wormhole and it swung. Marcus tried to roll clear. For a human, he was remarkably fast. He was not fast enough. The maul caught him on the left side. The sound it made was not something I can describe easily in any language I No, it was the sound of force meeting. Resistance and winning entirely. Marcus left the ground. He traveled through the air for nearly 2 m before landing on the rubble-covered floor, and when he landed, he did not roll or bounce the way soldiers do in training demonstrations. He landed like dead weight, like something that had simply been switched off. My scanner was already active before I was consciously moving. I ran toward him, medic's instinct overriding everything else. The readout on my wrist display appeared in cold, clinical numbers: 2 fractured ribs on the left side, 1 cracked, internal pressure building in the lower left lung, probability of a serious lung complication 61%, trauma indicators elevated across 6 separate biometric channels. I was already calculating the treatment sequence. I was already reaching for the right compartment in my kit. And then Marcus moved. I stopped walking. I stood completely still and watched him push himself upright with his arms slowly, with visible effort. His helmet visor was cracked across the left side. There was a dark stain spreading beneath his armor, where the impact had been worst. He got to one knee. He paused there for a breath, then he got to his feet. He picked up his weapon from the rubble. He looked at the Vreth Heavy, who had actually paused, apparently as uncertain as I was about what it was seeing. And then Marcus charged. I stood there with my medical kit open in 2 of my 4 hands, and I thought about what Orev had said to me years earlier in a canvas medical tent on a world whose name I can barely remember. Now, just watch. I watched, and I began to understand for the first time why the Vreth Dominion had not yet won this war. Part 2. The scanner on my wrist had a priority alert function. When a patient's readings crossed into critical range, it produced a quiet, sustained tone, designed to remain audible even in the middle of a firefight. I had heard that tone many times in 17 years of field medicine. I had never heard it sound quite so helpless. Marcus charged with cracked ribs and a compromised lung, and the alert tone sang steadily from my wrist like a long, slow question that no medical textbook had prepared me to answer. The heavy swung again. Marcus went under the arc of the maul. The weapon was enormous, and its size made it predictable at close range and drove his shoulder into the heavy's midsection. For a moment, nothing happened. The heavy looked down at the human pressed against its torso the way a stone wall looks at a hand pressed against it. Then Marcus pushed with his legs, and the heavy moved, not far, not dramatically, perhaps 3 cm, but it moved. I stood at the edge of the rubble field with my kit open and began doing what Selhari do when confronted with something the rational mind cannot easily accept. I documented. His heart rate had climbed to 162 beats per minute. For a human, this was the kind of reading that athletic trainers monitored carefully during peak physical exertion. For a Selhari of his age, this same rate would indicate a cardiac event requiring immediate intervention. For Marcus, it appeared to indicate concentration. His oxygen saturation had dropped to 91%. The healthy range for humans, as I have learned in my coalition medical training, was 95 to 100. Below 90, organ stress began in earnest. Below 85, unconsciousness was considered clinically inevitable. Marcus was at 91 and declining, and he was fighting a 3M machine built for the sole purpose of ending things. He could not overpower it, he knew this. I was certain he understood this clearly. And so he was not trying to. What he was doing instead was something. I had no single clinical word for it. The time he was staying close. Every time the heavy tried to step back and create the space needed to swing the maul effectively, Marcus moved with it, keeping himself inside its reach, making the weapon useless. He was using the heavy's own size against it. He had assessed the situation in real time, identified the single advantage available to a smaller opponent against a much larger one, and he was executing that plan with a precision that I found both fascinating and genuinely unsettling. A blow landed against the side of his helmet, not from the maul, from the heavy's fist, a backhanded strike that would have removed the head of any Silhari not wearing full combat armor. Marcus's visor cracked further. He staggered 2 steps sideways. My scanner added a new alert: concussive trauma, moderate severity. He steadied himself. He went back in. Owen, one of our Vulcan soldiers, young one, barely into his 2nd year of service, moved up beside me. Vulcan have large amber-colored eyes, built for distance vision. Owen's were as wide as I had ever seen them. Is he going to die? Owen asked me. He asked it quietly, the way people ask questions when they are genuinely afraid of what the answer might be. I looked at my scanner. I looked at Marcus. Not yet, I said. The fight lasted 11 minutes. I know this precisely because I logged every second of it out of pure professional reflex. 11 minutes of close range, grinding, relentless engagement between a human with 3 compromised ribs, a damaged lung, and a fresh concussion, and a breath heavy that outweighed him by a factor of 4. 11 minutes during which my scanner recorded 6 additional impacts on Marcus's body, none as severe as the opening blow, but each one adding to a running total that the alert system was now flagging as requiring immediate surgical assessment. What ended it was not a single decisive moment. It was accumulation, but not the kind I was expecting. The breath heavy was designed for power, not endurance. It was built to end confrontations in seconds, not sustain them across minutes. As the fight stretched on, its swings grew fractionally slower. Its footwork became marginally wider. These were small changes, almost too small to measure, but Marcus measured them. I could see the moment he registered the shift, a slight tightening around his eyes, a change in the angle of his stance, a new intentionality in how he was moving. He began pressing harder. He drove the heavy back against the broken wall. He went low, forcing it off balance, and then, in a sequence I have replayed in my memory more times than I can count, he grabbed the shaft of the war maul as it passed within reach, used the momentum of the swing to add to his own force, and drove the heavy into the rubble with a final committed push that the unbalanced weaponless breath could not absorb. The heavy went down and did not get up. The silence that followed was peculiar. Not the silence of a paused war. Gunfire was still echoing in other sections of the defensive line, but the silence of a small group of people who had just watched something and were not entirely sure their eyes had been accurate. Owen had not moved beside me. 2 Dravathi soldiers who had been fighting nearby had both stopped and were staring. Even the dust in the air seemed to hang still for a moment. Marcus stood over the fallen heavy. Breathing hard, I could see his chest. Working with each breath, careful. Measured, each inhale tested before it was completed. The lean in his posture told me everything my scanner confirmed. His left side was in considerable pain. He was managing it the way a person manages something unpleasant but non-negotiable. He was simply choosing not to let it be the loudest thing in the room. I crossed the rubble field to him. I did not ask for permission. I opened my kit. Left side, I said, 3 ribs, one of them is approaching a complication that will permanently affect your lung capacity if I do not address it within the hour. He looked at me, his cracked visor made it difficult to read his full expression, but what I could see of his face was patient, not dismissive. Patient. You have an hour, he said. I need you to be still for this. Give me 2 minutes first. He turned and walked the defensive line. He stopped at each position, checked each soldier, said a few words at each stop. 2 minutes, exactly as he had said. Then he came back, sat down against the wall, and extended his arm so I could access the side of his armor. I worked quickly and carefully. The lung compression was the most urgent concern. I administered a coagulant injection and an anti-inflammatory compound and applied a stabilizing brace across his left rib structure. He made no sound during any of it, not one. I had given the same treatment to Selhari soldiers of comparable injury levels who had required mild neural suppressants to hold still long enough for the brace to set. 4 minutes in, while I was securing the compression wrap, I asked the question that had been building in me since the moment he had stood up from that first blow. Do you not feel it? I asked. He turned his head and looked at me. There was no confusion in his expression. He understood exactly what I was asking, and he did not treat the question as strange. I feel all of it, he said. That is not the point. I did not respond. In 17 years of field medicine and 11 separate deployments across 4 different species, I had never encountered a statement quite like it. I feel all of it. That is not the point. I turned those words over in my mind. The way a Selhari turns a new equation over. Looking for the logic, looking for the structure, looking for the part where it resolves into something that makes sense. I wanted to ask what the point was then. If not the pain, I wanted to ask how a living organism could receive the accumulated damage I had spent the last hour cataloging and conclude somewhere in the quiet machinery of its mind that stopping was simply not an acceptable response to any of it. Before I could ask, the communications unit crackled. It was a coalition command frequency. The voice that came through was flat and professional, the kind of voice that delivers hard information without inflection because the person delivering it has learned to separate themselves from the weight of what they are saying. Our position had been reassessed. Vreth advance on the northern flank was more severe than initial projections had indicated. Reinforcements could not be redirected. An airstrike had been ordered against Vreth staging positions necessary to preserve the primary coalition line. The strike corridor included our current position. Time to impact, 31 minutes. We had been designated expendable. I remember the feeling that settled into my chest after that transmission ended. It was cold and heavy and very still. I had heard the word expendable used in military briefings before. I had processed it as a tactical category, a mathematical designation. Sitting in the rubble of the eastern wall with my medical kit in my hands, I understood for the first time that the word had a physical texture. I looked at Marcus. He had heard every word. He was already standing, already looking at the terrain around us with those quiet, measuring eyes, already thinking. He did not look like a person who had just been told his life had been written off by the organization he had served for 12 years. He looked like a person who had just been handed a new set of variables and was already working out what to do with them. "Pack your kit," he said to me. "We are going underground." Part 3. The tunnel beneath the supply station smelled of burned wiring and standing water. We moved into it in a broken line, 7 soldiers remaining from a unit that had started this engagement with 14, and when the access hatch sealed behind us, the sounds of the battle above became muffled, then distant, then like something happening in another world entirely. Not everyone was managing the situation the same way. Connor, a Dravathi soldier with a field dressing on his forearm and dried blood on his chest plate, sat against the tunnel wall and said what several others were clearly already thinking. "We cannot win this," he said, not as a complaint, not as a plea, as a statement the kind a person makes when they have run the numbers and found the result unacceptable but accurate. "Command has written us off. The strike window gives us 31 minutes before this whole section becomes a crater. There are at least 6 Vreth units between us and any viable extraction point. The mathematics are not favorable." No one disagreed with him. Owen was quiet. The 2 remaining Dravathi soldiers were staring at the floor. Even the air in the tunnel felt like it agreed. Marcus was standing a few meters away, with a terrain projection running from his wrist unit, a small pale blue light. In the dark, he had not looked up during Connor's speech. When Connor finished, Marcus said, "You are right about the math." Connor blinked. I believe he had expected an argument. "The math as it currently stands says we are finished," Marcus continued, still studying the projection. "So we chain the math." He turned the display toward us. The projection showed the layout of the supply station's lower levels, tunnels, access corridors, maintenance passages, service rooms. In the center of the northern section, there was a room labeled with the Coalition designation for a communications relay node. The airstrike command ordered was coordinated through this relay. Marcus said the Vreth are using it to run their entire ground operation in this sector. If the relay is destroyed, the strike gets recalled. Command will not fire into an uncoordinated active zone. The advance loses its coordination. It stalls. The evacuation corridor stays open for another 4 hours minimum, and the civilians in the lower tunnels reach the orbital lifts. He waited. The blue light of the map touched each face in the tunnel. "How far?" Owen asked. 400 m through the network. "Guarded?" "Almost certainly." I pulled up my tactical assessment program. I entered the variables: current personnel count, combined injury status, estimated Vreth defensive presence around a high-value relay, tunnel geometry, available time. The program returned its output in a few seconds. I looked at the number on my screen. Then I looked at Marcus. He was already watching me, and his expression said clearly that he had expected this number and had already moved past it. 11%, I said. That is the calculated survival probability for this approach. Higher than 0, Marcus said. He said it without theater, without a raised voice, without any particular emphasis. A plain fact. Then he closed the projection, checked the charge on his weapon, and started walking north through the tunnel. For a moment nobody moved. Then Owen stood up from the wall, checked his own weapon, and followed. Then the two Dravathi soldiers rose without a word. Then Connor, who had just finished explaining why this was mathematically impossible, got to his feet and joined the line. I packed my kit. I followed. We moved in single file. The tunnel was narrow enough that anything wider would have scraped the walls. Marcus led from the front. I held third position, close enough to reach the forward soldiers in an emergency. The air was damp and heavy, and we moved carefully, each footstep placed with deliberate softness. After roughly 150 m, Marcus slowed slightly and let me close the distance between us. Your scanner, he said, keeping his voice low. What does it say right now? About you specifically? Yes. I checked the readout. Oxygen saturation has improved marginally, 93%. The brace is holding. Heart rate is elevated but sustainable. You are also running a low fever. I know. You can feel it. Yes. And it does not change anything, he said simply. I walked beside him for a few seconds without speaking. Then I asked a question that was not in any way medical. You mentioned once that you have a daughter. Something shifted in his face. It was not pain exactly, softer than pain. Clara, he said, 9 years old. She lives with my sister on New Ohio. Does she know where you are? She knows I am deployed. I do not give her the details. A brief pause. She sends drawings through the network. Ships mostly. She has decided she wants to be a navigator. I thought about this small detail. 9-year-old girl on a quiet colony world, drawing ships, knowing only that her father was somewhere far away doing something important, not knowing he was in a maintenance tunnel with 3 cracked ribs and a fever following in 11% probability toward a room guarded by the most dangerous soldiers the Vreth Dominion could produce. Is that what you think about? I asked. When things become very bad. Sometimes, he said, but not in the way you might expect. I do not spend time thinking about whether I will make it back. That kind of thinking does not help anyone. I think about the reason. The job matters. He was quiet for a moment, watching the tunnel ahead. My grandfather fought in a war on Earth, an old conflict, long before the coalition existed. He told me once that the hardest part of that war was not the fighting itself. It was the understanding, the real, clear understanding that the people behind the line only get to have their ordinary lives because someone chose to stand in front of it, chose to decide that the cost of standing there was worth paying. And you believe this? I believe that someone has to, he said, so it might as well be the people who are already willing. I had no reply to that. I walked in silence beside him, listening to the distant sound of the battle above, filtering through the tunnel ceiling in muffled waves. Does it help? I finally asked. believing that he considered it genuinely before he answered. Yes, he said, it does not make any of this easy, but it makes it possible. The explosion happened with no warning. One moment the tunnel was quiet, the next a shaped charge detonated against the left wall approximately 40 m ahead of us. The Vreth had placed motion sensors in the network, as we understood afterward, but at the moment of the blast there was nothing in the world except the sound, the force, and the complete, sudden darkness as our tunnel lighting was destroyed. I was thrown against the right wall. I caught myself with two arms and kept the other two wrapped around my kit by pure reflex. The ringing in my ears took several seconds to clear, and when it did, I heard Marcus's voice already giving directions, calm, direct, specific, before the dust had finished settling. A second threat materialized behind us. The Vreth had used the explosion as the trigger point for a flanking approach. Through a parallel access shaft, we were being caught from both directions in a space no wider than 2 arm spans. 3 minutes, that is how long it lasted. I have reviewed my time log since and confirmed it. 3 minutes of the closest, most disorganized fighting I have witnessed in my career. The tunnel gave no room for formation or tactics. It was pure reaction, close quarters, personal. I pulled the two most lightly injured soldiers against the wall and kept them stable while the others fought. Marcus moved through the dark tunnel the way water moves through a crack in stone, always finding a way through, always finding the path the space allowed. Then the second device went off, smaller than the first and closer, a concussive charge designed to stun rather than destroy. It detonated within 4 m of Marcus. The scanner on my wrist screamed. Concussive trauma, severe tinnitus, possible eardrum damage, acute disorientation risk. Marcus, I said through the comm. Still here, he said. His voice had a slight unevenness to it. The pressure wave had affected his hearing. How many left ahead? 2 heat signatures, none remaining behind. Good, he moved forward. I still have no clean explanation for what happened in the next 40 seconds. He was concussed, partially deaf, operating with cracked ribs and a fever in a lightless tunnel, and he eliminated 2 Vreth soldiers with an efficiency that most fully healthy soldiers could not have matched. I documented it. I cannot fully explain it. And then we were at the edge of the relay room. Owen was first to the doorway. He moved to the gap at the entry corridor, looked through, and came back to us slowly. His amber eyes were as wide as they had been during Marcus's fight with the heavy. Above, he held up 4 fingers. 4 Vreth heavies inside. Then he held up 1 more finger separately and pointed. I moved to the gap and looked. The 4 heavies were positioned near the relay hardware, but behind them, standing in the center of the room with the unhurried stillness of a being that has never found it necessary to rush, was a Vreth commander. The armor was older than the standard issue around it, engraved with markings that I recognized as indicating length of service and number of recorded victories. The helmet was open at the front, showing a face that was heavily scarred and utterly still, watching the entry corridor with the absolute practice confidence of something that has spent its entire life being the most dangerous thing in whatever room it occupies. It saw us, or rather it saw Marcus, standing at the edge of the entry corridor. One hand pressed briefly against his cracked visor as though testing whether his vision was still reliable. Dried blood at his temple, the stabilizing brace visible at his side, where a piece of armor plating had been lost in the tunnel fight. The commander looked at him for a long moment. Then it laughed. Low, rhythmic, entirely without warmth. The snort's laugh of something that has assessed what it is looking at and found it insufficient. It said more clearly than any words that the thing laughing does not consider what it is seeing to be a real threat. Marcus stood in the entry corridor. He snorts looked back at the commander. He said nothing at all. I watched his hands. They were steady. Part 4. The Vreth commander had a translator unit mounted at its collar, standard issue for command rank officers who conducted operations in coalition territory. When it spoke, the translation came through in flat, correct standard coalition language, which somehow made what it said worse. It addressed Marcus directly. It listed his injuries, not as an insult, as a recitation. Clinical almost. It described the impact site on his left side. It noted the stabilizing brace. It mentioned the cracked visor, the blood at his temple, the way he was standing. It spoke about each injury the way a judge reads charges one by one, measured, allowing each one to settle before moving to the next. When it had finished, it told Marcus that a soldier in his condition could not continue. It told him that what he was proposing to do by entering this room was not courage, it was simply poor mathematics. Then it invited him to kneel. It told him the ending would be fast. I was standing 3 steps behind Marcus, and slightly to his left. I could not see his face. I could see his hands, and I could see the set of his shoulders, and I could see the small, measured rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. The commander's voice finished, and the echo of it faded in the hard walls of the relay chamber, and there was a silence that seemed to stretch longer than it actually lasted. And then Marcus smiled. I know this because he turned his head slightly to the right as he did it, not to look at me, just the small, involuntary shift that accompanies a change in expression, and I saw the edge of it. I had spent enough hours studying human facial expressions by this point to know that a smile from Marcus Vale was not a simple thing. I had seen him smile when something was genuinely funny. I had seen him smile when he was trying to put a frightened soldier at ease. This was neither of those. This was the smile of a person who has made a decision and closed the door behind them. He stepped into the room. What happened next is difficult to describe with the kind of precision I prefer. I have a detailed event log. I have scanner data. I have recorded fragments of audio, but a record of data points is not the same as a description of what the next several minutes actually felt like. Standing inside that room, the unit entered behind Marcus. The 4 heavies moved. Owen went to the right, drawing one of them toward the far wall. Connor and the 2 Dravathi soldiers split the other 3 between them, not elegantly, not cleanly, but with the focused desperation of people who understand that the only outcome they are working toward is buying their sergeant time. Marcus went straight for the Vreth commander. I will say this about Vrex Gall, and I learned the commander's name later from a coalition intelligence brief. He was not surprised. He had invited this. He stepped forward from the center of the room without hesitation, and the first exchange between them was fast and brutal, and left Marcus absorbing two hits that made my scanner produce sounds I had not heard it make before. A cut opened above his right eye from an armored backfist. He went back a step and a half, came forward again. I stood at the edge of the room for approximately 10 seconds. I had my medical kit. I had a clear line to any soldier who went down. I had 17 years of training that told me exactly where a field medic stands during an active engagement. Then Owen stumbled. A heavy had driven him into the wall, and his weapon had skittered across the floor. The heavy raised its maul. I put down my kit. I picked up Owen's weapon. And GT snorts. And GT. I fired twice into the heavy side, not enough to stop it, but enough to pull its attention. It turned toward me. Owen got up, recovered his weapon, and drove the heavy back into the fight. I am not a soldier. I want to be clear about this. I was not suddenly transformed by the moment into something I am not. I was a field medic holding a weapon I was not particularly skilled within a room where I had no business being anything other than a medic. But I was not going to stand at the edge of that room and watch Marcus Vale die. In it alone, that was the only clear thought I had, and it was enough. The fight around me was loud and close and continuous. I kept moving, kept drawing attention where I could, kept Owen and the others from being overwhelmed. And in the center of all of it, Marcus and Vrex Gall fought. Vrex Gall was enormous. It was fresh, unhurt, unexhausted, operating at full capacity. It had decades of combat experience encoded into its movements, and those movements were precise and powerful in a way that made watching them feel like watching machinery. It hit Marcus 4 times in the first 2 minutes, hard hits. My scanner was producing a continuous stream of alerts that I could not stop to read properly but could see, accumulating in my peripheral vision, like a list of reasons why this should not be continuing. Marcus went down twice. The first time, Vrex Gall stepped back to allow it the way a fighter steps back when they are certain the opponent will not get up, a pause to let the outcome confirm itself. Marcus got up. The second time, I was close enough to see his face clearly. He was on one knee. The cut above his eye had spread, and the blood was crossing his cheek in a thin line. His breathing was audible. His left arm was hanging at a slightly wrong angle. The shoulder had been hit hard, possibly dislocated. He was looking at the floor, and for 3 full seconds he simply stayed there. Those 3 seconds felt like standing at the edge of something very high. Then he raised his head. His eyes found Vrex's skull, and whatever was in them made the Vreth commander go still for a moment. In a way, it had not gone still during the entire fight. I do not know what Vrex's skull saw in that moment. I only know what I saw, which was a human being conducting a very quiet, very private negotiation with the limits of what was possible, and arriving at the conclusion that those limits were not yet relevant. Marcus stood up. Vrex's skull came forward again, faster. This time harder. I think it had decided that the ordinary rules of this situation were not working, and something more final was required. It was the first mistake the commander had made. Faster and harder meant more committed. More committed meant less room to adjust. When Marcus did not move the way the trajectory expected him to move, Marcus went sideways instead of back, and the force Vrex's skull had put into the blow carried the commander forward and, slightly off balance, and Marcus locked. Both arms, one good shoulder, one damaged one, around the commander's weapon arm and used the forward momentum to drive them both into the relay hardware bank along the northern wall. The equipment cracked, sparked, went dark, came partially back online in the wrong colors. Vrek struggled. It was stronger than Marcus. It would always be stronger than Marcus. It began to force its way upright. Marcus held on. I do not mean this metaphorically. I mean that in a purely physical, literal sense. Marcus Vale locked both arms around that commander and refused to release it. And every time it nearly broke free, Marcus found something in himself, some additional reserve that by any rational biological account should not have existed, and held on longer. The relay sparked again. A panel blew out in a bright discharge. Warning tones began sounding from the equipment rack. And then, with a final cascading failure that lit the room in harsh white light. For half a second the relay went down. The silence that followed was different from every other silence in that room. It was the silence of something important ceasing to exist. Vrek's skull went still, then it stopped. Fighting not from defeat, from calculation. A commander who has lost their communication relay in an active engagement has other priorities to attend to. It disengaged. It turned toward the secondary exit at the rear of the chamber. It paused at the doorway and looked back at Marcus, who was still standing, one hand on the damaged relay bank, breathing in controlled, careful intervals. The look the commander gave him was not readable to me. It was long and unblinking, and I have thought about it many times. Then the commander left. The four heavies pulled back with it. The room went quiet. For 11 seconds I counted them. Automatically, helplessly, Marcus stood with his hand on the relay bank and said nothing and moved nowhere. Then, in the same way a building comes down after the structural support is removed, he simply went down, not fast, not dramatically. He folded at the knees, and I was already moving, and I caught his left side with two of my arms before he reached the floor. Got you, I said. I said it before I had decided to say it. It was not a medic's phrase. It was not in any manual. He made a small sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. The relay, he said. Down, I told him, completely. The strike. I checked the comm. The coalition channel was already active. Command had registered the relay failure, and the airstrike corridor had been marked inactive pending recoordination. The civilians in the lower tunnels had their 4 hours. Recalled, I said. It is done. His eyes closed for a moment, then opened again. Good, he said. That is good. I began working on him immediately. The dislocated shoulder first. It needed to be stabilized before movement, then the new lacerations, then a full reassessment of the rib structure which had held through everything the last hour had put it through, which remained, medically speaking, somewhat beyond my ability to explain. Owen crouched beside us. His own armor was damaged across the chest, and he had a deep bruise forming along his jawline. But he was upright and functional. Is he going to be all right? Owen asked. It was the same question he had asked earlier above the rubble, watching the fight begin. I gave him the same answer I had given him then, because it was still the honest one. Not yet, I said, but working on it. The evac transport arrived 14 minutes later. It came down through the orbital window that the relay shutdown had opened. A coalition medical retriever, large enough for the whole unit, piloted by a crew who had clearly been informed something significant had happened, but had not been told exactly what. They helped load our soldiers. They were professional and fast when they loaded Marcus onto the transport stretcher. One of the medics on the crew, a young human woman named Petra, judging by the name stenciled on her collar, looked at the injury readout and then looked at me with an expression I recognized as a mixture of confusion and professional disbelief. How long was he in the field like this, she asked. I told her the duration of the engagement from the first injury to extraction. She looked at the readout again. She said nothing further, but she looked at Marcus differently after that. The way people look at something when they are revising what they thought was possible. Through the transport bay doors I heard a coalition command channel activate. General's voice, clipped and efficient, reviewing the engagement data that had already been transmitted. He mentioned the relay destruction. He mentioned the recalled strike. He said the survival and operational success of the unit was, given the recorded injury conditions, medical anomaly. The words settled into me in a particular way. Cold, clean, something that was not quite anger but was related to it. I sat beside Marcus's stretcher as the transport lifted. I looked at his face, still in the careful way of someone doing the hard work of healing, which is its own kind of fighting. I thought about the word anomaly. I thought about 2 fingers pressed against a collarbone, a 9-year-old girl drawing ships, a grandfather's voice explaining why someone has to stand in front of the line. I thought, there is nothing anomalous about this, you are just looking at it wronged. Part 5. I filed the official medical report on Staff Sergeant Marcus Vale 6 weeks after the engagement on Kareth IV. The document ran to 41 pages, 22 of those pages were clinical data, biometric recordings, scanner logs, treatment notes, procedural records. I have written longer reports. I have written shorter ones. I have never written one that took me as long as this one did, not because the data was difficult to organize, but because every time I looked at the organized data, I had the same uncomfortable feeling that the document was technically accurate and substantially incomplete. The injuries cataloged in order of occurrence: 2 fractured ribs and 1 cracked rib sustained from a primary concussive trauma, moderate from a secondary impact to the helmet. Oxygen saturation declined to a minimum of 89% during active engagement, recovering without intervention to 93% within 40 minutes. Second concussive event, severe from a proximity detonation in the tunnel network at approximately hour 20. Possible partial eardrum damage, right side. Low-grade fever sustained throughout the final 6 hours of the engagement. Deep lacerations above the right eye and along the left forearm during the relay chamber confrontation. Shoulder dislocation, left side, sustained in the final exchange with the VRETH commanding officer. Cumulative biometric stress index recorded at 2.7 times the coalition threshold for mandatory medical evacuation, a threshold that exists because exceeding it is associated in all documented cases with loss of function. In all documented cases, I submitted the report within 3 days. It had been flagged by 2 separate Coalition Xenobiological Research departments and 1 military performance oversight board. I received formal requests for supplementary data, technical clarification, and in one case, a request for an interview from a researcher who used the phrase unprecedented physiological record in her first message to me, underlined. I responded to the technical queries. I provided the supplementary data. I declined the interview. What I did not tell the researchers was what I wrote instead in my private journal on the evening I submitted the report, a journal I have kept since my first deployment, in which I record the things that do not belong in official documents. I wrote, today I filed a report about a human. I called what he did a medical anomaly because that is the category available to me. I do not believe it is the correct category. I believe I am using the wrong framework entirely, and I am not sure this framework can be repaired. Marcus spent 12 days in the Coalition medical station on Harith orbital platform before he was cleared for light activity. I had expected to receive an update on his condition through the standard recovery channel and then move on. I had 4 other patients from the engagement who needed monitoring. I had a complete post-engagement field report to write. I had regular responsibilities. On the 8th day, I found myself walking through the medical wing at a time when none of my patients were scheduled for assessment. I told myself I was taking a different route through the station. This was not true, and some part of me knew it was not true, and I walked the route anyway. The door to his room was open. He was sitting up in the recovery bed, not lying down, sitting up, his back straight, a data slate balanced on his knee. He was watching recorded footage from the engagement, not the overview footage. That command reviews individual helmet cam footage from the relay chamber, the angles and angles again, examining decisions, adjusting his understanding of what had worked and what had not. He looked up when I came to the door. Medic, he said. I was passing by, I said. He looked at me with the patient expression I had come to associate with moments when he knew something was not quite accurate but chose not to press on it. He gestured to the chair beside the bed. I sat. For a while neither of us said much. I asked about his shoulder, recovering. Well, the ortho team was satisfied. He asked about Owen, about Connor, about the others. I told him the status of each one. Owen had been discharged 2 days earlier, heading back to the Vulcan home system for a period of leave. Connor had requested reassignment to a different sector, which I thought was reasonable and did not say so aloud. The 2 Dravathi soldiers were both recovering on the station. And you? Marcus asked. I am fine, I said. Are you? I considered the question. I am processing, I said, which was a more accurate answer. He nodded. He seemed to understand what that meant without requiring elaboration. I told him about the research flags on the medical report. I told him about the xenobiology departments and the performance oversight board and the researcher who had underlined the phrase unprecedented physiological record. He listened without visible reaction. They will write papers about you, I said. They will try to explain what you Did in biological terms, they will look for a mechanism, something chemical, something structural, something in the way human pain receptors are distributed, or the way human adrenaline functions under sustained stress. And will they find it? He asked. I do not think so, I said. I think they will find pieces of it, enough to write the papers, enough to produce a coherent scientific explanation that satisfies the review boards and gets published in the right journals. But I do not think the biology is actually the answer, I said. I have studied human biology. It is remarkable in certain ways, but it is not so far removed from Selhari or Dravathi physiology that it should produce what I watched you do over those 22 hours. The Dravathi have faster nervous systems. The Vulcan have denser bone structure. I have 4 arms and superior manual control. I paused, and yet Marcus set down the data slate. He looked at me directly in the way he did when he was giving something his full attention. In Selhari culture, I continued, we have a concept called the boundary of the possible. It is not a philosophical idea. We treat it as a practical one. It is the point past which action becomes irrational. When a Selhari calculates that the boundary of the possible has been reached, we stop, we redirect, we find another approach, or we accept the result. This is considered wisdom. This is considered the foundation of good decision-making. That sounds reasonable, Marcus said. It is, I agreed. It has also on several occasions in our history caused us to stop when we should not have. He was quiet. What I watched you do in that relay room, I said, and on the wall before it and in the tunnel between them, you were past the boundary. My scanner told me so. The mathematics told me so. Vrexkel told you so in detail before the fighting started, and you treated all of it, the scanner, the mathematics, the commander, as information rather than as a verdict. Because it is, Marcus said. Information tells you where things are. It does not tell you where they have to stay. I sat with that for a while. Clara sent another drawing, he said. Then, after a comfortable silence, a ship, this time with the crew visible in the windows. She drew an alien crew member with 4 arms. A pause. I think it might be you. I did not know what to say to this. I found that I was unexpectedly moved by it, which was itself unexpected. Selhari do not typically experience what humans describe as being moved. We experience evaluation shifts, reassessments of how we categorize something. I categorized the image of a 9-year-old on a colony world drawing 4 arms into the crew of her imaginary ship, and something in the categorization felt significant in a way that had nothing to do with data. She sounds remarkable, I said. She is, Marcus said. She gets it from her mother. Before I left, Petra, the young medic who had treated Marcus on the transport, stopped me in the corridor outside his room. She was carrying a recovery chart update, and she looked slightly hesitant, the way people look when they are not sure whether information is welcome. They have offered him a medical discharge, she said, full honors, full pension. The board reviewed the cumulative injury record, and they say it is fully supported. I see, I said. Did he accept? She looked at me for a moment, then she almost smiled. He filed a reassignment request instead, she said. Sector 9, that is the current active front. She moved on down the corridor. I stood where I was for a moment. Then I went back to the doorway. Marcus was already looking up when I arrived, as though he had expected me to return. Sector 9, I said. Yes, he said. That is the most contested active sector in the current theater. Yes. You have cracked ribs, a recovering shoulder, residual concussion effects that the neurological team wants to monitor for another 3 weeks. Yes, he said, I know. I looked at him, he looked back. Neither of us said anything for a moment, and then I am not entirely sure why I did this, except that something in me needed to do it. I extended my right hand. I have 4 hands. I extended the one on the upper right, which is the closest placement to a human single right hand. I had read about the handshake. I had never performed one. Marcus reached out and took my hand. His grip was firm and warm and immediate. The way he did most things, he held it for a moment, then released. Take care of yourself, Kelthar, he said. I will do what I can, I said. Take care of yourself, Sergeant. Same answer, he said. I walked back to my quarters and I sat at my desk and I opened my private journal. The official report was already submitted, already filed, already being dissected by researchers in offices I would never visit. The 41 pages of clinical data, the graphs, the biometric logs, the treatment sequences, all of it organized and accurate and waiting in the coalition system to be studied and cited and used as the basis for other documents. What I wrote that night was not for the researchers. I write it here now instead because it is the truest account I have of what Kareth IV was and what Marcus Vale was, and what I understand now that I did not understand before. I came to this war as a scientist. I had been in enough wars by then to think I understood what war was. I understood triage. I understood probability. I understood the boundary of the possible. And I respected it the way my species has always respected it, carefully, mathematically, with the quiet confidence of people who believe that wisdom lies in knowing exactly where the limits are. On the 17th hour of the engagement on Kareth IV, a Vreth Heavy drove a warm maul into the left side of a human being, and my scanner told me in clinical numbers that what happened next should not happen. The lung, the ribs, the accumulated cortisol, the oxygen saturation, the mathematics of recovery time versus the mathematics of the continuing situation. Every instrument I had said the same thing. This is the boundary, this is where it ends. And Marcus Vale stood up. Not because his body had recovered, it had not because the pain had lessened, it had not because the situation had improved, it had not. He stood up because somewhere in the quiet interior of himself, he had decided, cleanly, privately, with no audience, that the boundary was a piece of information and not a verdict, and he was not done yet. I have thought about this for 6 weeks. I have thought about it in the language of biology, and in the language of neurology, and in the language of the military performance models I have spent my career working within. I have read the early drafts of the papers the researchers are writing. I have seen them find the pieces they expected to find, the adrenaline patterns, the pain threshold data, the structural resilience of the human rib cage under compression, and assemble them into an explanation that is technically coherent and professionally satisfying. It is also, I believe, fundamentally incomplete, because what those papers measure is What the body did, they cannot measure. What Marcus decided, they cannot locate in any scanner readout or biometric log. The moment when a person looks at the full weight of everything that is happening to them and determines that it is not sufficient reason to stop, that moment is not in the data. I was there. I had more instruments running than anyone. I watched every number. Moment is not in any of them. What I watched in that relay chamber, Marcus on one knee, blood on his face, damaged shoulder, everything my training said should already be over, and then watching him raise his head and get up again and again and again until it was done. That is not a medical record. That is something else, something that belongs in a different category than the ones my education gave me. The Vreth Dominion has fought across 43 systems. They have removed 19 distinct civilizations from the list of living things in this galaxy. They do this because they have found, across a long history of conflict, that all living things have a boundary. Find the boundary, apply sufficient force, and what lies on the other side of the boundary is compliance, and then removal. They have not finished this war. I used to think the reason was the coalition's superior numbers, or our combined technology, or the strategic coordination of so many species working together toward a common goal. These things matter. I do not dismiss them. But sitting in a medical bay watching a human review helmet footage of a battle, his body had no business surviving. I think about a different reason. I think about what Vreck's skull saw when it looked at Marcus in that entry corridor. I think about the laugh, so confident, so certain, so grounded in a lifetime of experience that had always confirmed what the laugh assumed. I think about the moment the laugh stopped making sense. The Vreth know how to find boundaries. They are very good at it. They have spent centuries learning to find them precisely and applying exactly the right force and watching things stop. What they have not learned, what I am not sure can be learned by a species that experiences the world the way the Vreth experience it, is what to do with something that treats its own boundary as a starting point. I will be reassigned to Sector 9 in 3 weeks. I have submitted the request alongside Marcus's. The Coalition Medical Board processed them together without comment. I carry more equipment than standard regulation allows these days. I calculated how long an engagement in Sector 9 might last, and I packed accordingly. I believe this is arithmetic. I filed my report. I called what Marcus did a medical anomaly. The researchers are grateful for the data, and the papers will be published, and the data will be cited, and all of it will be accurate. But I lied. There is nothing anomalous about it at all. It is the most human thing I have ever seen, and I have come to believe after 6 weeks of thinking about it with everything I have, that the most human thing I have ever seen might also be the most important thing in this war. Someone has to stand in front of the line. Marcus Vale knew this before he ever arrived on Kareth IV. He packed extra ammunition because he knew it. He stepped forward when everyone else stepped back because he knew it. He got up off the floor of that relay chamber twice because he knew it. And now, somewhere at the edge of a contested Sector 9, with a healed shoulder and a new set of ribs that will always ache a little in cold weather, he is standing in front of another line. I intend to be there with him. This time I will bring my kit, and I We'll pack for a longer engagement.